The road to Odd, West Virginia, ends long before the map says it does. Beyond the last gas station, where the mountain fog moves like a living thing, the asphalt gives way to dirt, and the dirt dissolves into silence. Locals say that somewhere beyond that silence lies a hollow where no one goes twice. It's a place time forgot, or maybe a place time refused to remember, the home of the Whitakers. The story doesn't begin with the family themselves, but with a traveler who couldn't resist the whisper of the forbidden. He came armed with a camera, a notebook, and the confidence of a man who believed he'd seen everything Appalachia could hide. But he hadn't. Not even close. When he reached the hollow, the first thing he noticed was the smell: wet wood, iron, and something faintly animal. Then came the eyes. From behind a curtain of trees, faces watched him with an intensity that was neither curiosity nor fear, but something far older and more primal. Their house sagged under decades of decay, its porch swallowed by vines, its windows clouded like cataracts. The man raised his camera, thinking he'd capture an image of forgotten poverty. Instead, he captured the collapse of humanity itself. A tangle of figures shuffled from the doorway, barefoot, dirt-caked, their expressions unreadable. They didn't speak. They grunted. They stared. One woman, her eyes misaligned and unblinking, began to laugh softly to herself, a sound that echoed through the valley like something half human and half remembered. No one warned him about the sounds that came after sunset. The metallic clicking from the woods. The hollow laughter carried on the wind. Or the rhythmic tapping from beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living creature. By the time he realized what the Whitakers truly were, it was too late to turn back. The road had vanished behind him, swallowed by the forest. And as his camera recorded the final moments before dawn, he understood why no one in the nearby town spoke their name out loud. The Whitakers weren't just a family. They were what happens when isolation becomes inheritance, when the line between survival and sin blurs beyond repair. And somewhere in those mountains, their bloodline still breathes, waiting for the next curious soul to find them. The story begins with the kind of curiosity that often precedes disaster. The filmmaker, drawn by local rumors and fragmented tales told in trembling voices, set out to find the truth behind a family said to live deep in the Appalachian wilderness, untouched by civilization. Locals in the nearest town called them the Whitakers, though even saying their name made some people uneasy. They warned him that the hollow they lived in wasn't just remote, it was wrong. They spoke of a place where compasses spun, where voices echoed without a source, and where daylight never seemed to linger. He laughed it off, thinking it all superstition, until he reached the foothills and realized the forest around him had gone utterly still. As he drove deeper into the mountains, the world seemed to fold in on itself. The road narrowed until it was nothing more than a rutted path swallowed by trees so tall they strangled the sky. Cell service vanished. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the scent of rot and iron. Every now and then, he thought he saw shapes between the trees, figures moving just beyond his headlights, too tall to be human, too slow to be animals. The deeper he went, the more his sense of direction dissolved. It was as if the forest itself wanted him lost. Hours passed before he found the first sign of habitation, a rusted mailbox leaning crookedly, its letters worn to nothing. Beside it, a narrow dirt track curved upward into the mist. The moment his tires touched that path, the sound of the world seemed to fade. No birds. No insects. Only the crunch of gravel and the faint thump of his heartbeat. He drove on, every instinct urging him to turn back, but the thought of uncovering something unseen, something forbidden, pushed him forward. The trees thinned just enough to reveal a clearing, and there it stood, the hollow. It wasn't a town, not even a village. It was a scattering of collapsing shacks stitched together by twisted fences and strands of barbed wire. Smoke curled from a single chimney, though no fire was visible. There were tools hanging from the porch, rusted and wrong in their shape, as if made by hands that had forgotten how tools should look. He turned off the engine, and the silence rushed in again, heavy and expectant. Somewhere beyond the clearing, a low moan drifted through the trees, rising and falling like the breath of something ancient. In that moment, he realized the journey had not brought him to the edge of civilization, it had carried him past it, into a place where the world had stopped turning long ago. The first encounter happened before the filmmaker even realized he was being watched. He had stepped out of his car, camera in hand, and the mist seemed to tighten around him like a living thing. The hollow was unnervingly still, yet he could feel movement, a presence shifting just beyond sight. Then, from the corner of his eye, a figure emerged. A man, or something that once resembled one, standing barefoot in the mud. His clothes hung in tatters, his hair matted into ropes, and his eyes were clouded like river glass. He didn't speak. He only stared, his head twitching slightly, as though some thought struggled to find its way out but never could. The filmmaker raised his camera, and the click of the shutter shattered the silence like a gunshot. From behind the man, another figure appeared, a woman, her face twisted by generations of something neither nature nor nurture could explain. Her eyes pointed in different directions, her mouth drawn into a perpetual, uncertain smile. She made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a moan, a guttural vibration that crawled beneath the filmmaker's skin. Then came another, and another, until a small group stood in front of him, all watching, all silent except for their strange grunts and murmurs. There was a rhythm to the sounds, a kind of communication that didn't belong to any language he knew. He tried speaking, offering greetings, explaining who he was, why he'd come. But his voice felt misplaced here, a foreign intrusion in a world that had forgotten speech. The man nearest him tilted his head and blinked rapidly, as if trying to understand the words by their sound alone. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, his breath harsh and uneven. The filmmaker froze, his pulse racing. The man reached out, touching the camera lens with one trembling finger, leaving a smudge of dirt and something darker. The moment stretched until it became unbearable, and then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the Whitakers retreated. They moved in a jerking, almost animal way, retreating toward the decaying house with a shuffling gait that seemed learned rather than natural. At the doorway, the woman turned back and began to hum a low, wavering sound that carried an eerie sadness. It wasn't until later, listening to the recording, that the filmmaker realized the hum wasn't random. It followed a pattern, almost like a lullaby. But no mother had sung it. It was a song born of silence, the echo of a bloodline so far removed from the world that even words had withered away. He didn't know it then, but this first meeting had already marked him. In the hollow, once they saw you, you became part of their story, whether you wanted to or not. The more time the filmmaker spent in the Whitaker's hollow, the more he realized that the land itself seemed to breathe with secrets. The house was surrounded by things that made no sense, objects that didn't belong to any modern world yet carried a purpose he couldn't decipher. All around the property stood strange, handmade totems, rough structures of branches tied together with frayed rope and strips of fabric. Some had animal bones woven into their frames, others bore shapes crudely carved into the wood, circles, spirals, and symbols that seemed to repeat across the property like warnings or prayers. The filmmaker approached one of the totems and noticed that the wood was warm to the touch, though the air was cold. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed something alive, something waiting. Behind the house, he found a row of trees marked with deep carvings. They weren't initials or simple scratches. They looked deliberate, almost ceremonial, each one depicting a figure with hollow eyes and outstretched arms. The deeper he ventured, the more these carvings multiplied, twisting around the trees like a language only the mountain understood. Some symbols were new, freshly cut, while others had been there for decades, eaten by moss and time. A chill crawled down his spine as he realized they encircled the property completely, forming a boundary that felt ancient. In the middle of the clearing stood a structure made from stacked stones, roughly the height of a man, with a rusted tin can placed carefully on top. Inside the can, he found small objects, a cracked marble, a bird skull, a broken comb, and a piece of human hair braided into a loop. He didn't touch it again. Every instinct told him these things weren't random, that they served some ritual purpose. When he turned back toward the house, he noticed the family watching from the porch, silent and still, their expressions unreadable. The youngest of them, a boy with sunken eyes, pointed toward the woods and shook his head slowly, as if warning him not to cross that invisible line again. As dusk fell, the forest around him seemed to close in. The totems cast long, distorted shadows across the ground, their shapes bending and stretching like fingers in the dying light. The wind picked up, and somewhere within it, He thought he heard voices, low murmurs that rose and fell in rhythm with the creaking branches. He tried to convince himself it was only the sound of nature, but the symbols on the trees glowed faintly in the fading sun, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt that the hollow was not merely isolated, it was protected by something older than the family itself. The next morning, the filmmaker drove into the nearest town to ask questions, hoping to understand what he had stumbled upon in the hollow. The people there were wary of him from the start. When he mentioned the Whitakers by name, conversation stopped. A woman at the diner dropped the coffee pot she was holding. An older man sitting near the window muttered something under his breath and left without finishing his meal. The air grew heavy with unease, and the only sound was the buzz of a flickering neon light. Finally, an aging sheriff, whose uniform looked as worn as the mountains themselves, approached and told him quietly that some stories were better left buried. The filmmaker pressed him for details, but the man only sighed and said the Whitakers were the last of what shouldn't have been. Later that day, the sheriff agreed to talk privately, though not without hesitation. They sat in his small office, where old photographs of missing hikers lined the walls. He spoke in a slow, deliberate tone, as though each word carried weight. He said the Whitakers had been living in those mountains for longer than anyone could remember. Their ancestors settled there before the Civil War, building small cabins and keeping to themselves. Over time, the family stopped mixing with outsiders entirely. Marriages happened only within their own bloodline, generation after generation, until the outside world became a distant myth. What had started as survival had turned into obsession. According to the sheriff, strange things began happening in the hollow decades ago. Visitors reported seeing fires in the woods where no one should have been, and hearing low, animalistic sounds echoing through the night. Once, a census worker went up there and never came back. When search parties tried to look, the forest swallowed them in mist and confusion. The few who returned spoke of figures moving through the trees, watching but never approaching. The sheriff's father had gone up once as a young deputy and came back silent, never willing to discuss what he saw. The sheriff warned the filmmaker that the Whitakers weren't dangerous in the way most people thought. They didn't kill or hunt strangers for sport. Their danger was something quieter, something inhumanly patient. He said isolation changes people, but isolation that lasts generations does something worse, it warps the very idea of humanity. When the filmmaker asked why no one intervened, the sheriff simply said, "You can't save what doesn't want to be saved." The words lingered long after the conversation ended, echoing like a verdict. When the filmmaker returned to the hollow, he found the Whitakers waiting for him, as if they somehow knew he had been speaking about them. Their faces were unreadable, but their silence carried a weight that made his stomach twist. He tried to appear calm, lifting his camera to resume filming, but the family's mood had shifted. There was an uneasiness in their movements, a tension that hadn't been there before. The oldest member, an elderly man whose skin hung loose over sharp bones, sat on the porch, his cloudy eyes following every step the filmmaker took. When the camera pointed toward him, he spoke for the first time, his voice cracked and rasping like dry leaves. What he said wasn't an answer but a riddle, a fragmented story of their blood, their land, and the curse that bound the two together. Through broken words and half-remembered sentences, the old man spoke of keeping the line clean, a phrase that chilled the filmmaker even before he understood its meaning. He said their ancestors came to the mountains to escape something, though he never explained what. Over time, he said, outsiders stopped coming, and the family began to believe that mixing with the outside world would destroy them. The hollow became their whole world, a cage disguised as protection. Children were born from unions no one dared question, and each generation carried both the burden and the secret of that decision. They called it the way, as though it were a sacred duty passed down from the beginning. The filmmaker tried to ask if they understood what that had done to them, but the question only made the old man's expression harden. He lifted a shaking finger toward the woods and muttered about the ones who watch, insisting that outsiders had brought sickness before and would do it again. There was fear in his voice, but also conviction, a belief that what they were doing was not wrong, but necessary. The younger family members shifted uneasily as he spoke, their eyes darting between the filmmaker and the trees. It was clear that even among themselves, they did not all share the same faith in their isolation. As dusk settled over the hollow, The old man's story grew stranger. He said that every time someone from the outside tried to take one of them away, the mountains would bring them back, as if the land itself refused to let the family die out. The filmmaker didn't know whether it was madness, myth, or memory speaking, but the words sank deep into him. That night, as he replayed the recordings, he realized that the old man's fragmented tale wasn't just about the past, it was a warning about what happens when survival becomes something sacred and twisted beyond recognition. The discovery happened by accident. While exploring a collapsed barn behind the Whitaker home, the filmmaker noticed a faint glimmer of light cutting through the dust. The air was thick with decay, every step releasing the scent of mold and rust. He swept aside the debris and found a wooden chest half buried under broken boards. It was covered in dirt and cobwebs, the lock rusted but weak. With one sharp pull, it gave way, revealing stacks of old photographs bound together with string. They were worn and faded, the paper warped by moisture, but what they showed made his hands tremble. The earliest photographs were black and white, taken with cameras that hadn't been used in generations. They showed families gathered in front of the same sagging house he had seen in the hollow. The faces were unmistakable, wide-set eyes, drooping features, pale skin stretched too thin. At first, it was only subtle. But as the photographs moved forward in time, decade by decade, the changes became more pronounced. Faces began to blur together, the similarities too strong to be coincidence. Each generation seemed to collapse inward, the line between sibling and parent impossible to tell. By the final photos, the expressions had lost all trace of familiarity with the world beyond those mountains. There was no laughter, no warmth, only vacant stares and twisted smiles. Among the photographs, one stood out. It showed a young woman holding a child whose face was almost indistinguishable. The woman's eyes were wild, defiant, yet filled with despair. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, someone had written "She took him away." The filmmaker didn't know who had written it or what it meant, but it struck him with the force of something forbidden. He began to notice small, recurring details: an iron cross nailed above every doorway, a carved emblem that appeared in nearly every photo. Whatever it symbolized, it seemed to hold the family together, like a curse disguised as faith. He slipped a few photographs into his bag, though every instinct screamed not to. That night, as he reviewed the images under the dim glow of his lantern, he felt something was wrong. In one picture, barely visible at the edge of the frame, was a dark shape among the trees, a figure standing too still to be human. It wasn't in any of the other photos, but when he zoomed in, the face resembled one of the older Whitaker men he had met earlier that day. The realization hit him with a cold clarity. The photograph was dated 1934. Whoever, or whatever, that figure was, it hadn't aged. The hollow didn't just trap the living. It seemed to keep something else alive, long after it should have faded away. The house had always felt wrong, but it wasn't until the filmmaker noticed the locked door at the end of the hallway that he realized how deep that wrongness went. The door was made of thick wood, darker than the rest, and reinforced with rusted metal brackets. Unlike the other rooms, which were cluttered and half-collapsed, this one was sealed tight. Every time he passed by it, he could hear faint noises coming from within: soft scratching, a low, rhythmic thump, and occasionally something that sounded like breathing. He asked one of the family members, a middle-aged woman who rarely spoke, what was inside. She froze, her eyes darting toward the door before she shook her head violently and walked away without answering. From that moment, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The family watched him more closely, as if afraid he might try to open it. The noise grew louder at night. He would lie awake on a broken sofa, his camera battery charging beside him, listening to the sound of movement from behind that door. Sometimes, it was quiet for hours. Other times, it came in bursts: scratching, dragging, and something that could only be described as a whimper. The air smelled different near the room, thick and metallic, like rust and rot mixed together. He tried convincing himself it was an animal trapped inside, but the uneven pattern of the sounds suggested intent, as though whatever was in there knew he was listening. Curiosity eventually won over fear. One afternoon, while the family was outside, he brought his camera and flashlight to the hallway. The door had no knob, only a heavy latch and an old padlock, which, to his surprise, hung open as if someone had unlocked it and forgotten. His pulse quickened as he lifted the latch and pushed. The door groaned but didn't give easily. A wave of stench poured out, something foul, like old blood and wet earth. He covered his mouth and stepped inside. The room was small, its walls blackened with soot. There were blankets piled in the corner, matted and damp, and in the shadows, something shifted. The beam of his flashlight caught a glimpse of movement, a figure crouched low, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. Its skin was pale and stretched thin, its body trembling as it let out a guttural moan that barely sounded human. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight, its beam spinning wildly across the walls. The sound that followed was neither a scream nor a cry but a rasping echo that clawed at the air. Before he could react, the family appeared behind him, their faces blank, their voices raised in a series of sharp, incoherent noises. The woman slammed the door shut and locked it again, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. The filmmaker stood frozen, his heart hammering as realization struck him. The Whitakers weren't hiding something from the world. They were trying to keep the world safe from what was inside that room. Night fell heavier than usual over the hollow, pressing against the walls of the Whitaker home like a living weight. The filmmaker had barely slept since the incident with the locked room. Every sound made him flinch, the wind against the shutters, the creak of the floorboards, the faint murmuring of the family through the thin walls. It was sometime after midnight when he noticed one of the younger Whitakers, a man in his early 20s with a blank stare and jerking movements, pacing near the doorway. The man kept glancing toward the woods, muttering words the filmmaker couldn't understand. Then, without warning, he bolted outside and disappeared into the darkness. At first, the filmmaker thought nothing of it. He assumed the man had gone to relieve himself or gather firewood. But minutes turned to an hour, and the woods remained silent. When the filmmaker stepped outside to look for him, the cold hit him like a wall. The forest was unnaturally still, and the mist hung low, swallowing everything beyond a few feet. Then he heard it, a sharp, distant sound, like a twig snapping underfoot, followed by a whisper that might have been his name. He turned toward the noise, flashlight trembling in his hand, but saw nothing except the endless grey fog. Against better judgment, he followed the sound deeper into the trees. His camera was recording as he walked, the beam of light cutting through the black. He called out once, then again, his voice small and hollow in the vast stillness. Then, for a fleeting second, he saw movement ahead, a shadow darting between the trees, quick and fluid. He ran toward it, breath ragged, only to find a clearing littered with bones and old scraps of fabric. The air reeked of death and damp soil. His flashlight flickered, and in that strobe of light, he caught the shape of the missing man standing at the far edge of the clearing, perfectly still. The man's head was tilted upward, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide as if staring at something above. The filmmaker shouted, but there was no response. He stepped closer, and the figure began to move slowly, unnaturally, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Panic surged, and he stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The flashlight fell, plunging everything into darkness. When he finally managed to turn it back on, the man was gone. Only the soft crunch of leaves suggested something had passed nearby. Terrified, he ran back toward the house, gasping for air, but when he arrived, the Whitaker family was gathered outside, their faces calm and expectant. The old man simply nodded, as if he had known this would happen. The next morning, the filmmaker found the missing man's camera half buried near the clearing. The footage ended abruptly, but in the final frame, something else was visible behind him, a tall, thin silhouette watching from the trees, its eyes gleaming like glass. By the time the filmmaker decided to leave the hollow, he was no longer sure if he was escaping something real or something his mind had conjured in the darkness. The days had blurred together into one long stretch of unease. The Whitakers barely spoke, but their eyes followed him everywhere, as if they knew he was planning to go. He packed his camera, the photos, and his scattered notes into the car before dawn, when the fog was still thick enough to hide him from their view. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. He didn't look back as he drove down the narrow path that wound through the mountains. But even as the house disappeared behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following. The forest pressed close, the trees forming walls of black. In his rearview mirror, He thought he saw shapes moving between the trunks, but when he blinked, they were gone. It took hours to find the main road again. When he finally reached the nearest town, his hands were trembling, his eyes red from exhaustion. He went straight to the sheriff's office, slamming the door open and demanding to speak to someone. The sheriff listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the filmmaker showed him the photographs and a few minutes of footage, the man's face paled. After a long silence, he said only that there had been others before him who tried to bring proof out of the mountains, but the evidence never survived. The sheriff advised him to destroy everything, to forget what he had seen, but the filmmaker refused. He was determined to show the world the truth. That night, in a cheap motel room, he reviewed the footage frame by frame, trying to convince himself it was all real. But strange things began happening. The images on his camera flickered, and faint whispers bled into the audio, his own voice repeating words he never spoke. The more he watched, the more distorted the faces became. Sometimes the Whitakers' eyes seemed to follow him through the screen, shifting slightly when he wasn't looking. When he tried to upload the files to his laptop, they vanished, replaced by static and a low humming that grew louder until he had to shut the computer off. He left town the next morning, leaving the camera behind at a small diner, hoping someone else would find it. Weeks later, a local boy discovered it and turned it over to the authorities. What they found on the memory card wasn't what the filmmaker had recorded. The footage was darker, slower, filled with sounds that no one could identify and faces that weren't there before. The filmmaker never returned to retrieve his belongings. Some say he disappeared into the woods again, drawn back by something the mountains refused to let go. Years later, long after the filmmaker vanished, the footage he had captured in the hollow resurfaced online. No one knew who uploaded it or how it had been recovered, but the video appeared suddenly on a small, obscure forum dedicated to lost media. At first, it seemed ordinary, grainy clips of decaying houses, silent forests, and blurred faces. But those who watched long enough began to notice things that shouldn't have been there. Shadows that moved independently of the people on screen. Voices whispering beneath the static, too faint to identify yet impossible to ignore. Some claimed they heard their own names spoken, others said they saw reflections that didn't match the figures in the frame. Within days, the video spread across social media, drawing the curious, the skeptical, and the obsessed. Most viewers dismissed it as an elaborate hoax until a few sharp-eyed watchers compared it to the filmmaker's original work, archived years before. In the new footage, there were moments that no one could explain, frames showing the same scenes but from different angles, as if another camera had been filming alongside him. In one sequence, the filmmaker himself appeared on screen, standing at the edge of the forest, though the timestamp suggested he had been the one behind the lens at that moment. In another, the locked door that had haunted him was open, the darkness inside pulsing faintly as if something within was breathing. What disturbed viewers most, however, was the final minute of the video. The screen went black, and then, slowly, a faint image emerged, the Whitaker house, filmed from a distance, bathed in pale moonlight. A figure stood at the window, motionless, watching. Then a second appeared, and a third, until every window glowed with a face. They didn't move. They didn't blink. They just stared outward, as though they were waiting for whoever was watching to acknowledge them. The clip ended with a sound that froze anyone who heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping, echoing through the static, 3 times in perfect rhythm. Not long after the video began circulating, reports surfaced of strange occurrences among those who had watched it in full. People spoke of waking in the night to find muddy footprints near their doors, of hearing grunts and low laughter outside their windows. A few claimed to see shapes standing at the edge of their yards, half hidden in shadow, their heads tilted just like the Whitakers in the film. The account that first posted the video was deleted within days, but the footage never vanished completely. It appeared again and again under new names, always slightly altered, as though the story itself refused to end. Somewhere deep in the Appalachian mountains, where mist still crawled through the trees, the Whitaker house was said to still stand, waiting for the next lens brave or foolish enough to find it.